All right, and here we go. Lights, camera, action. So here's a brief look at how we're going to spend our time together this evening. We do have about 90 minutes, but we have a lot of information to go through, so it is going to move quickly. That's a heads up to everybody. We're going to start. Anna is going to walk us through a quick intro to Partnerships for Parks for those who may not be familiar with all the things that we offer here at PFP, as we often call ourselves. Then I'm going to jump in and walk us through a review of our program guidelines. So if you've taken a look at our guidelines, we'll be talking through these in simple language, breaking down exactly what everything means, from general information to eligibility, the kinds of funding you can receive, and what types of work we support. And then the next piece, which I think is always really interesting, is we're actually going to walk through our application using screenshots from the application itself. So there are no surprises, no gotchas. You know exactly what it is we're asking, and I'm going to be as direct as possible and give you tips on how to approach each question. So hopefully this is helpful to all of you. And then we're going to go ahead and end it with that Q&A that we talked about. So once again, just a reminder to drop those questions in the chat as they come up. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Anna for the intro.
Okay, yeah. So once again, I'm Anna. I'm the Grants and Resources Coordinator here at PFP. We're a joint program between the City Parks Foundation and the New York City Parks Department. CPF, City Parks Foundation, has a goal to invigorate and transform parks into dynamic, vibrant centers of urban life through sports, arts, community building, and education programs, while the New York City Parks Department is committed to the creation, maintenance, and care of vibrant parks and public spaces in all 5 boroughs to create a greener, brighter future. So at PFP, we combine these values, work with grassroots community partners just like all of you, supporting parks, communities, and publicly accessible open spaces through the entire city. And we do this because we believe that thriving parks mean thriving communities. We're also very proud to share that this is our 30th anniversary. So whether you've been here with us from the beginning or this is your first time, we're really excited to welcome you here in this process. Next slide. So these are some of our fall 2024 grantees. That's our most recent grant round. We awarded over $200,000 to 50 groups. These groups are community-led groups and small nonprofits from across all 5 boroughs. With our grant, they're able to host events and programs in publicly accessible open spaces within their communities. So a few examples of activities, programs, events that have been made possible by the Green Fund are film nights, composting programs, tree planting and maintenance, dance lessons, and also my favorite, which is building a pollinator garden. So there's really a wide variety of what you can do, and we really just appreciate and promote creativity in your programs. So in addition to the grants, PFP also has a few different areas of work. Our It's My Park program supports volunteer stewardship and beautification events in green spaces throughout the city. So these might be things like planting native species, cleaning up litter in parks, or maintaining trails. Last year, this program supported over 33,000 volunteers across 1,600 projects across all 5 boroughs. So there's probably an event somewhere in your area, so you can check our website for upcoming events. They pick up a lot too in the spring and summer. So if there's not one happening now, there will be soon near you. We also have something called the Partnerships Academy, which is like trainings that we host, both virtual and in-person workshops. These are for groups to develop skills to keep working in local parks and open spaces. So these workshops may be on like how to organize events, how to crowdfund, how to budget, just anything that will like help groups expand their capacity to continue to do work in their community and open spaces. We haven't had any of these pretty recently because we haven't had a trainings manager, but we're hiring a new person for that, so they will pick up again later this year. We also have PFP staff that are work in community engagement. So we have community engagement coordinators across all 5 boroughs. They're dedicated to certain spaces within each borough. I'll touch on that in the next slide in a minute. And our Catalyst program is a longer term engagement program to expand equitable access to parks and open spaces, specifically focusing on what are classified as historically underserved parks. So mostly just focused on equity and expanding this access to places that haven't had it in the past and have not been necessarily focused on as much in parks and green space effort in the past. And then there's grants, which is us. And next slide. So our community engagement program, our community engagement coordinators, which we also call CECs, they work hyper locally with community members. Each one is dedicated to a specific area. This is Curtis right here. You can see those are the areas he works in. So they really get to engage and know these communities really well and establish relationships. They are going to be your go-to people for navigating administrative questions with the Parks Department, like permitting for your events, or asking questions about events that may be occurring or stewardship opportunities. If you're not already connected to your CEC, reach out and say hello. We're going to share a directory of them in a follow-up to this presentation. Definitely reach out to them if you want. They're all very friendly and very eager to work with groups. They really enjoy it. So they're a great resource. And I'll hand it back to Zach to discuss the application.
Awesome. Great job, Anna. And thank you so much for giving everyone a little bit of intro to Partnerships for Parks and all that we do beyond the grants program. So now we're here for the meat of it, what you all have been waiting for. But I like to always just slow down right at the top and ground us with a sort of vision statement that we have for the New York City Green Fund Grassroots program, which is that this program is intended to advance the viability of grassroots initiatives across parks and open spaces in all 5 boroughs and to foster a resilient network of equitable public green spaces. There's a lot to unpack here, but I really like to focus in on just a few key terms. This is about the viability of grassroots initiatives, right? We know that community-led efforts can often be challenging. They're not often resourced well enough, not getting the support that they need. Our program hopes to make a difference in that and make things a little bit easier, a little bit more viable. It's also about equity. We're going to talk a little bit later on in this presentation about how Partnerships for Parks thinks about equity, how we measure that, and how we like to be transparent in whether or not we're reaching our equity goals. But the other piece is that we also are interested in building a resilient network, right? Resiliency is about being able to take a hit and come back, right? To weather storms, to adjust and adapt to challenges. If our programs are great, but they're only great while we're here, then that's not resilient. So we always have to be thinking about how we're building for the future, right? Like so much of what we do is about putting things in the ground and watching it grow. We don't want something to be here just for a season. We want it to last. So that's what the Green Fund is all about. A quick note for our returning grantees before we get into things. You may have received a grant in the past from either of these programs, the Green Relief and Recovery Fund, the Capacity Fund, or Green Arts Live. The Green Fund, what we're talking about tonight, is now your all-in-one destination for grassroots funding from Partnerships for Parks and City Parks Foundation. Those programs were sort of rolled up into one in 2023, repackaged and expanded, and that is now the New York City Green Fund Grassroots program. So just in case we've got any folks who have been around for a while, just want you to know you're in the right place. All right, here's where things get serious. I'm going to ask you all to pull out your notebooks, pull out your calendars or your phones, because these dates are very important. We are currently in the middle of the application process. It opened January 22nd and it closes February 28th at 11:59 p.m. So right before midnight on the end of the month. That is the deadline to submit your application. Please, please, please do not be late. During that period of time, we're going to be continuing to host weekly info sessions like this one over Zoom. And we also offer one-on-one consultations. So a consultation is a little bit like if you ever had a teacher in high school or maybe in college who allowed you to submit a first draft of a paper and they would review it with you. A consultation is just like that, but with a grant application. So if you put together a full draft of your grant, I will actually sit down with you one-on-one and spend 30 minutes going through everything line by line, pointing out anything that I think could be improved, anything that you might have misunderstood. And I think it's an incredibly valuable resource that not nearly enough people take me up on. You may think that, oh gosh, he probably doesn't have any time for me. Trust me, I do. Please, please, please book a consultation with me. It really does seem to help folks, and I'd love to talk with you one-on-one. Now, after our application closes February 28th, we begin what's called the review process. So, unlike many other grant programs that you may be familiar with, where someone in my role, maybe a program manager or a grants manager, would typically have all the decision-making power to decide who gets funded and who doesn't, we like to do things a little bit differently here at Partnerships for Parks. So our review process starts with a pre-screen, essentially looking through all the applications that came in and making sure that no one's asking for $10,000 to buy a brand new car, right? That this is all stuff that makes sense with the program. And then anybody who is aligned with our vision and what we're doing here goes on and goes to the grant review committee, which is made up of about 24 folks from across our organization, Partnerships for Parks, as well as City Parks Foundation, and other partners from across parks and other peer organizations. We meet for 2 full days essentially, and collectively, in a large sort of consensus-based process, move together to decide on everybody that is getting funded. Now, we think that produces much better results because it means there are more voices in the room and more perspectives. And however, that does take a little bit longer. So I want to just acknowledge that because you may be wondering, oh man, I applied in February, where's my decision? This is what we're doing, and this is the amount of time it takes. So, by the time that's all done, we'll submit everything for final approval from Partnerships for Parks and CPF leadership, as well as our Green Fund donors. By the time all of that is finished, we aim to have notifications, so final award notifications sent to everyone by May, by the beginning of May. So what that would mean is if you're funded, you would receive a grant agreement letter that we would need you to sign. Your grant term would begin. But for those who unfortunately are not awarded, I do want you to know that we really respect the time that you all are putting in, whether it be on this call or just spending time working on the application. So anyone who applies and at least makes it to that grant review committee stage, you all are entitled to 15 minutes of declination feedback. So, you can hop on the call with me and I will talk you through concrete things like, hey, here's what worked, here's what didn't, here's how it can be better next time. We want to make sure that you're not wasting your time, and that if you put the effort to be a part of our program, then we're going to respect that time and that labor, and we'll do our best to get back to you with ways that you can improve. So just a heads up as we get deeper into this process. But again, the most important thing, you can't be awarded if you don't apply. So please, please, please submit your application by February 28th at 11:59 p.m. When you receive these slides in the follow-up, you can literally just click the link on this page and it'll take you directly into the application if you haven't seen it already. All right. And then one last thing, I just want you all to know that I really encourage you to shoot your shot. This is not going to be the only pun of the evening. I apologize. But I hear from groups all the time that, this is the first time ever applying for a grant, or I don't know if this is for me. I don't know if I can do this. And if you're someone who's feeling that way at all, at any point during tonight's presentation, please listen to me now. You can do this. We are here to support you. We want to see you succeed. That's why we offer these info sessions. It's why we offer the consultations. You miss 100% of the shots that you don't take. So please, please, please apply and take advantage of the resources that we're offering because you can do it. And we want to see the amazing projects that you have in mind. All right. But how do you know if this really is a program for you, if you're even eligible? Well, we have some nifty criteria. This is a checklist that exists in our guidelines document, and it's fairly straightforward. So first and foremost, applications must be submitted by a member of a group or an organization. I like to say that we're not here to support solo acts. So Applications that are submitted on behalf of individuals aren't eligible. This is a group project. Second point, applications must be submitted on behalf of a 501c3 organization or a group utilizing a fiscal sponsor. Applications submitted by LLCs or 501c4 organizations are not eligible. So let me break this down a little bit. So if you're a nonprofit with a 501c3, you're good to go. You already knew that. However, if you're someone who doesn't have that official 501c3 status, I want to be clear about what this means. You're still able to apply. You just need to use a fiscal sponsor. Some of you may already have an external fiscal sponsor. You'll know if you do. If you don't, we'll talk a little bit later on in the application. There is a box that you're going to click when you're going through the application to request one-time fiscal sponsorship from us directly. And that basically means that we are going to allow you to apply for these funds without having a 501c3. So that's what I really want to make sure that you understand from this. If you're a 501c3, you're good to go. If you don't have a 501c3, we still want to welcome you. You're just going to have to click a box on the application and it'll all be good. So that's the important piece there. Next, applicants' total expenses for the most recently completed calendar year must be less than $175,000. So you can't have spent more than $175,000 last year. If you did, then we don't consider you grassroots. You would be eligible for our upper tier of programs, which we're not talking about this evening. So please just be aware, we're talking about your total expenses for 2024 need to be less than 175K. All right, moving on to the next set of eligibility pieces. If you've received a grant from us since 2020, all of your interim and final reports must be submitted prior to applying for new funding. So if you're a recent grantee, make sure you have those reports in. They are very, very important. And next, applicants must possess demonstrated experience working in New York City's publicly accessible open spaces and have a strong connection to the communities they're working in. If you're someone who your organization is based in Upper Manhattan, we're probably going to have some questions if you're applying to do work in a random park in deep Brooklyn, right? We're going to have questions about what your connection is to this neighborhood, your community, why you're kind of parachuting in to go do work there. At the same time, if you're someone who is, maybe new to working in parks, I want you to know that that demonstrated experience piece, you can be flexible with that, right? Maybe you've done similar sorts of programs at public schools, but you've never done anything like this in a park. Maybe you're a performing arts group who's done, this type of a show all over before, but you're interested in bringing, public theater to an open space. We want to encourage you to apply. It's just make sure that you're really leaning in and explaining to us why you have the skills to carry out what it is that you want funding to actually accomplish. That's really the important piece. And then next, applicants' proposals must support work in NYC's publicly accessible open spaces, and we list a whole bunch of different options. Parks, playgrounds, community gardens, street trees, NYCHA properties, public plazas, open streets, and waterfronts. All sorts of different options, but the big important piece is that they must be publicly accessible. Oftentimes we'll get applications from folks who want to do programming on like green roofs or things like that. But that's not exactly, readily available to the public. There are often a lot of barriers that people have to go through. I use that just as an example. Obviously, this is a case-by-case basis, but really your space should be publicly accessible, and ideally it will be on publicly owned land. So just please keep that in mind. We know that this can be kind of complicated sometimes, and it's a really critical piece of the application because if you're not eligible, you don't want to waste your time. So totally understand that. If you have any questions about eligibility, please email us at greenfundgrassroots@cityparksfoundation.org. And Anna, could you please drop that in the chat? Thank you so much. Because like I said, we don't want you wasting your time if what you want to do isn't going to be eligible. So if you have any questions about this particularly, please, please, please reach out to us sooner rather than later. All right. Next is the part that everyone's really excited about, which is the money. So we kind of break things down into two tiers with their grassroots program. And I'm going to ask everyone to focus in on the left side of the screen here first. So when we think about our most grassroots groups, these are folks whose total expenses last year were less than $10,000. I want to be clear here that you may be a brand new group who didn't spend any money last year, and so you're thinking, well, I don't even have total expenses. That's okay. Your total expenses were zero. That is still less than $10,000. So don't worry about it. You're included in this group. Anyone whose total expenses were less than $10,000 last year may apply for up to $2,500. So that's the limit of what you're eligible to apply for. Now, groups with budgets on the bigger side of things who spent over $10,000 last year, whatever it is that you spent, whatever your total expenses were, you can apply for up to 25% of whatever your total expenses were. So, to give you a quick example, let's say I was part of an organization and our total expenses last year were $40,000. I would be eligible to apply for up to 10,000 because that's 25% of 40,000. I know it can be a little bit complicated, but we think that this structure really provides the most flexibility for groups at all various sizes, right? Folks whose budgets are all the way up to 175,000 and all the way down to, maybe $100. This allows us the flexibility to really meet folks where they are. Now, somewhere all in the middle of that, we also have a floor and a ceiling. So one thing to keep in mind is we will not make grants less than $1,000. So no grants of like $100. You have to be getting at least $1,000. And we will not make grants over $40,000. So even if you're at the top end of our limit, we will not make any grant that is over $40,000. So that is the ceiling, and the floor is 1,000. Everyone should be somewhere in between there, depending on your situation. This is just a handy flow chart. This is in the guidelines, so I'm not going to go over it, but it basically is just to help you understand what you may be eligible for and the various options available to you through this program. One thing that you might notice here is on the left-hand side, it talks about 2-year grant support. So we are very proud to offer 2-year funding support to a subset of our applicants. To be eligible for 2-year funding, you need to meet two pieces of critical criteria. First of all, you must have received a grant from us since 2020, so this is only available to our more recent grantees, and you also must have submitted all of your interim and final reports. If you meet those 2 points of criteria, so you received a grant from us since 2020 and all your reports are in, you are eligible to apply for up to 2 years of funding. Now, what that would mean, though, is a couple of things. So when you're applying for 2-year funding, you need to be sure that your funding request is the same amount for both years. The funding request is a specific point in the application where you essentially tell us how much money you want. It's important that that amount is the same for both years. So what I always like to say is if you are eligible for $2,500, that means you can get $2,500 each year of those 2 years. It's not $2,500 the first year and then 10,000 the next, right? So just keep that in mind as you're planning out your project budgets, that whatever you're receiving, you would receive the same amount for each year. Another way to say that is that 2-year funding does not change your per year funding maximum. So again, that $2,500 limit or 25% of whatever your total expenses were. That doesn't change with 2-year funding. It's just you're getting the same amount each year for 2 years. I know this can be a little bit tricky, which is why we are going to check for understanding. So again, sorry everyone, I'm very corny, but I'm gonna ask you all to play along with me here. We're gonna go through a couple of examples, and I would like everyone to please put your answers to these questions in the chat so that I'm sure we all are on the same page. So first and foremost, if your organization's total expenses for last year were $10,000 or less, what is the maximum amount of funding that you can apply for per year? And if you can put your answers in the chat. All right, great. $2,500, $2,500. All right, we got this one. We got this one. This one was easy. This was the warm up. All right. Question two. What if your organization's total expenses last year were $20,000? What's the maximum amount that you can apply for then? So your organization's total expenses last year were $20,000. Great. 5,000, 5,000. Shout outs to Robin, 25% of the budget. I respect it. I always hate making people do math after 5 o'clock. So I feel you. But yeah, $5,000 or 25% of that 20K is exactly correct. Last question, and this one, I want everyone to listen very closely. If your organization's total expenses last year were $5,000 and you're eligible to apply for 2-year funding support, what is the maximum amount that you can apply to receive per year? So your expenses were $5,000, you're getting 2-year funding support. How much can you receive per year? Awesome. Y'all are on top of it. 2,500, 2,500, 2,500. Correct. Correct. All right, everybody, you're really with it. Great job. Thank you so much for entertaining that. It is just a really critical part of this. We see groups stumble on this all the time. And I hate to be like this, but it's important to remind everyone that at the end of the day, a grant is a legal agreement to exchange money. And so it is really, really important that these numbers add up and that your numbers are correct. So please, please, please double, triple check all the numbers that you're submitting in your application because it is really, really important. And I would hate to see you stumble because of it. So great job, everyone. And I'm going to move us along. All right, way more fun. So you've got your funds. What type of work can you actually do? The Green Fund Grassroots program supports work in 7 different program areas. So we have them listed out here, but I've got slides with pictures, so I'm going to move us along because those are more fun. First of all, we have stewardship. Stewardship covers a lot of things and can be defined in a few different ways, but here at Partnerships for Parks, we define it as community-led care of open spaces such as volunteer service and beautification projects. Some examples might include planting a native flower garden, caring for a dog run, or organizing beach cleanups. These are all examples of stewardship projects. Next, we have environmental action. So, this would be educational and advocacy programs that provide community members with the knowledge and skills to take responsible actions to protect the environment. Examples might include hosting a teach-in on the impacts of shore erosion, developing a proposal for your local community board in support of composting, or organizing an advocacy campaign against local sources of pollution. It's really about connecting people in your community with the knowledge and skills to take responsible environmental action. Next, we have organizational development. These are activities or resources that support your organization's ability to activate public space, such as staff training, strategic planning, communications, financial management, fundraising, HR systems, or even transition or succession planning. So these are all the things that happen outside of our public spaces that allow your group to really go to the next level and better carry out the work that you're doing every day. So this category is a little bit different from some of our others in that it's not necessarily taking place in these open spaces, but really, again, about bringing your group's ability to the next level, that capacity building element. I do want to just shout out that grant recipients of this category may receive pro bono design support for website, brochures, or marketing materials from Partnerships for Parks art director Anne LaFond. So if you include in your budgets, funding for any of those types of materials, and maybe able to work with you to help you design those materials. So it's a really wonderful process and is great. So please just keep that in mind. Next, we have youth development, which I always like to remind folks does not just mean anything involving kids. We love children at Partnerships for Parks, but what we're talking about here are specifically programs that inspire children under 18 and young adults between 18 and 24 to pursue green jobs through hands-on service learning, paid work opportunities, and professional skills training. So that might look like a career day that you host with a local elementary school. It might mean supporting young people through paid internships or developing a mentorship program with professionals in the environmental sector. This is what we're talking about when we talk about youth development. Next, we have health and wellness, which is fairly straightforward, but anything that promotes physical, mental, and emotional health of the people using New York City's parks and open spaces. So that could be yoga in the park, as you see here in this picture. It could also be a free neighborhood basketball league or even weekly nature walks. All of these things are really wonderful and contribute to our health and well-being. Next, we have arts and culture, which is also fairly straightforward, but performing and visual arts and community-oriented cultural programs. Uh, this could be really a lot of things. A celebration of traditional cultural dance, public theater performances, a movie night, arts and crafts making, or a music festival. Really, the sky is the limit when it comes to arts and culture. And then lastly, I want to shout out Con Edison Urban Forestry Grants. So this year we have special funding provided by Con Edison with additional support from the Helmsley Foundation that has been reserved for proposals focused on our urban canopy. So this could be anything related to the care of our trees. So whether that be street trees or whether these be that may be trees in other parts of the environment, but really specifically interested in street trees, we're talking about mulching or weeding, cleaning up trash, watering of trees, but also educational events to help community members better understand the effects that trees have on our climate and the importance of tree stewardship. So if your organization is interested in thinking through this kind of work, maybe this is something that's been on your to-do list for a long time. Now is the perfect opportunity to really take that step into the world of tree care because there is special funding available to those groups who are interested in doing that sort of work. So definitely encourage you all to consider it. Now, next, we're going to talk a little bit about ineligible and eligible expenses. So, under all of those categories, there are many, many things that you might spend money on to actually carry out your projects. Some things are allowed and some things are not. So, again, focusing on the left side of the screen here, our eligible expenses are things like equipment, tools, plant materials, supplies. This is 99% of what most of you are going to be asking for money for. So that first bullet point really contains a lot. The second piece might be consultants, vendors, contractors, all of these sorts of things. These are really just a bunch of different words for people that you are paying to come and provide a service. So the example I always like to use is if you're hiring a DJ and you're saying, "Hey, I'll pay you $500 to play at, this barbecue that I'm hosting in the community garden." That's great. That person is a vendor or a contractor. That's what we mean by all of this. Next, there's staffing costs and stipends for volunteers, which are two separate things, but very similar. So, staffing costs are basically what it costs you to pay an employee. An employee, to be very clear, is anyone that you file tax paperwork for with the government. That is staff. That's an employee. Um, Stipends, on the other hand, are for volunteers. Stipends, I know they sound very, very similar. How and like, what do you even mean? You're paying volunteers. But basically, a stipend is any money that you might provide to someone who's coming in and doing like volunteer work, but you just want to acknowledge the time and the effort that they're putting into it. Um, Two really important things. On the staffing side of this, staffing costs are only eligible for 501c3 organizations. So if you're not a nonprofit, you don't have tax paperwork for people. So you shouldn't be, having staffing costs. So that's one thing. And for those 501c3s, I would just say that a good rule of thumb is you are eligible to apply for staffing costs, but please be mindful of how much you're asking for. Your staffing costs should not be more than 50% of your total ask, is a good rule of thumb. On the other hand, for stipends for volunteers, The important number to keep in mind is that you cannot spend more than $600 per person when you're putting out stipends. That $600 limit is in place because once it goes beyond $600, it triggers a bunch of paperwork that you need to file with the IRS, and we don't want you to do that, and we don't want to be responsible for that either. So the limit for stipends is $600 per person if you're getting it through this program. Beyond that, any other programming costs, impact assessment costs, or anything relating to marketing and outreach, all of that's totally good, eligible. The ineligible stuff is going to seem really, really basic, but we need to say it just to make sure that everyone hears us. First and foremost, you cannot spend money on maintenance work conducted by anyone other than volunteers or interns. So I always like to say you cannot pay someone to come and mow the grass for you. You cannot pay someone to come and plant the flowers. This is about volunteer work. We're also not going to pay your rent or any other form of office overhead. We're not going to pay you to go hit the campaign trail and electioneer for candidates. You cannot be lobbying public officials. And we're not going to pay your bills if you get sued or have any other form of litigation. So don't include any of that stuff in your application. It will be turned down. All right. Next, we're going to get into the application walkthrough. So these are the actual questions that you all will be filling out. First and foremost, how do you find the application? We have a link right here. Once you open it up, you will be brought to our grant portal, which is what you see here. You will scroll down through our programs and find Spring 2025 Grassroots Program. You will click Open and under where it says Action, and that will launch you right into the application. But I also just want to flag here with this red box up in the top corner. I will be using red boxes and arrows through the next section of the presentation to call things out. Up in the top right corner, you can see where it says English or Espanol. We're really proud to be once again offering all of our application materials in both English and in Spanish. So if you're someone who's more comfortable working in Spanish or reading Spanish, you're absolutely welcome to do so. Just click Espanol and everything that you see within our grants portal will automatically translate for you. We also have copies of our guidelines and FAQ documents in Spanish available as well. So please share that with anyone in your network so you know who might be more comfortable working in Spanish. We want those folks to know that they are still welcome to apply. Beyond that, we get into the first page of our application. Our application is split up into 3 pages, and the first page is all about eligibility. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here because it's really just a rewording of each of the eligibility pieces that we've already talked about, but reformatted as yes or no questions. So you should all know how to answer those things. But what I do want to call out is, again, up in the top right-hand corner, there's a little box that says Manage Collaborators. We often get questions from folks who say, hey, I'm working on this application, but someone else in our group really wants to help out. How can they access the application? How can they work on this? The answer is through this collaborators function. So if you want to add someone to your application, click on that Manage Collaborators box. It will open up a little pop-up. And what you do is just put in their email address, and then they're going to get an email that will allow them to jump in and join you in your application. Now, there's one other important thing to know about that, though. My dad always had a saying that he said, son, if you start something, then you need to be the one to finish it. And as weird as it sounds, that also applies to grants in our portal. So it is a weird feature of our grants portal, but whoever starts the application has to be the one to actually press the submit button. This is not a thing that we can change. It is baked into the website. But it's just something to be aware of because we get questions all the time. People on the final day of the application are always freaking out. They're like, I keep hitting submit and it won't go through. It won't go through. And it's because someone else was the person who actually started the application. They're just a collaborator. So please keep that in mind and let anybody know who you're working with, that you need to be the one to actually press submit. All right, moving on into the more substantive pieces here. The second page of our application is all about general information. So first, we're going to ask an optional question, which is, how did you first learn about our program? This information, again, is optional, but really, really helpful to us to know how our outreach efforts are working, and who's actually spreading the word about this opportunity. So please do fill it out. We would really appreciate it. Next is we're going to ask a little bit of information about your organization. So you may notice that you only have 100 words. Let that be your guide throughout this entire application. If we're only giving you 100 words for something, that means we do not expect a novel. We do not expect, your PhD thesis. We're looking for a couple of sentences, and that's okay. So briefly summarize your purpose or guiding vision. What is it that your group exists to do? What do you care about? That's what we're, kind of the quick and dirty of who you are. Moving on, we give you a little bit more space here to summarize your organization's history with our parks and open spaces. And in this box, I would encourage anyone who holds relationships with whether that be park staff or other folks responsible for maintaining the open space that you want to work in. If you're someone who has a good relationship with those administrators or other folks like that, feel free to include that in this section. It's really helpful for us to know. Again, this doesn't mean you're ineligible if you don't have those relationships, but if you do, brag about it. It's really helpful in thinking about how you're going to carry out the work that you're laying out for us. Moving on, this gets into the piece. These two questions kind of feed right into one another, and it's really important for how we measure equity at Partnerships for Parks. It's one of the ways we measure equity. So first and foremost, we're going to ask you to describe your organization's leadership structure, and we recognize that could look very different depending on your group. You might have a board of directors, or you might have something way more informal, just a couple of really core volunteers who hash things out in a group chat. Whatever that is, we just want to know who it is that's ultimately the people who are making decisions for your organization. It gives us a sense of how you operate, and is also important for our follow-up question, which is about the sort of demographics of your leadership. So once you tell us who your leaders are in your organization, we follow that up by asking whether the majority of those folks, the people who you just told us about, are people who are Black, Indigenous, or other people of color. We have a publicly stated priority in our guidelines and in many of other documents to support BIPOC-led organizations, and there's no other way for us to know whether or not we're doing that if we do not ask you this question. I know that some folks can be a little bit uncomfortable around this, but I want to be very clear. This is not an eligibility question, but it is a question that we require you to answer so that we can track our own internal metrics and make sure that we are living up to our commitments. So that's really important. Now, if you answer yes, and the majority of your leadership are Black, Indigenous, or other people of color, we're going to ask you to briefly just list who those people are and their roles. So Joe is the secretary, and Caitlin is the president, and that's whatever. We don't need their full family history. Some people are like, oh, do you want us to tell their full background and who they are and what they are? Don't worry about it. We just need to know who their names and whatever their role is. Um, and now if you answer no, that's also okay. We're just going to ask you kind of how it is that you're thinking about connecting with your local community, and how you're thinking about growing diversity within your organization. Because people of color exist in all parts of the city, and we want to make sure that every group that we support is thinking about how to bring in a diverse and inclusive set of folks into the work that you're doing. All right, moving on from that, we have the fun world of tax status. This is very straightforward. You should know as you look at these sort of multiple choice option here, or excuse me, this set of options here. You should know if you're a 501c3 organization or if you have an external fiscal sponsorship, so on and so forth. But I really want to flag the last bullet. We are a volunteer group that would like to request one-time fiscal sponsorship from Partnerships for Parks through City Parks Foundation. It's a mouthful, but that is the option that you are going to select if you are a group without a 501c3. That is what you select. that is what allows us to actually go ahead and grant you these funds should you be awarded. So that last bubble is the one you're going to pick if you're not a 501c3. Following that, we're going to ask you for a number, and that number should reflect your organization's total expenses for the most recently completed calendar year. So 2024, how much money did you spend? That's what we were talking about, right? All the way back when we were talking about funding amounts. That number is really important because it determines how much you're eligible to receive. So that's where you're going to give us this information about last year. Everything on page 2 is about last year. So how much money did you spend in 2024? And then if you tell me, hey, we spent $20,000, the next thing I'm going to ask is for you to prove that to me. And what that looks like is uploading a document. It can be an Excel, it can literally be just a typed out list, whatever it is, but we need a breakdown of what you actually spent money on so that we can confirm you're being honest with us, basically. You know, we trust you, but we do want to see those things laid out. So you say $20,000, you should provide us with some sort of documentation that shows that you actually spent $20,000. Because again, it's very important because it relates to how much money we're eligible to give you. So that's why we need that confirmation. We understand that this can be complicated for some folks and that some of you may not be used to tracking your expenses in this way. So if you're concerned at all about what to upload here or you have any questions about this budget document, please reach out to us again at Green Fund Grassroots at cityparksfoundation.org. We're more than happy to work through it with you. I would just add that don't wait until the last minute to reach out about this step. Budget stuff can be complicated, and if you're reaching out to us with 3 days before the deadline trying to figure out your budget, it's going to be really, really hard to work with you in that time frame. So please don't procrastinate on this. If you need help, reach out, we'll help you, but please do so in a timely manner. Moving on, we are going to ask a bunch of questions about the geographic area that you're working in. So within our application, you're actually able to select and tell us about 3 specific open spaces that you may want to work in. You do not have to work in that many, but you're allowed to select up to 3 sites that you will be working in through this grant program. And we're going to ask a bunch of basic information, the name of the place, an address for it. Now, I will say you may be thinking, well, a park doesn't have an address. How does that work? We just want the address, like the nearest address you can find. So a street address near there. This is basically to allow us to map things out using some mapping software. And it's easier if we have street addresses. So just provide that address if you can. It doesn't need to be exact. We're also going to ask what type of open space it is. So again, going back to that list we talked about in our eligibility section, you're going to choose what type of open space it is. Then you're going to tell us what borough it's in. And from there, depending on what borough you select, it will open up a sort of secondary question asking about what community district this space is located in. Community district is another term for community board. So if you're familiar with your community board, you know, for me, I'm in Brooklyn Community Board 4. You have a drop down here that you would pull down and select. Now, that's really easy if you know what your community board is already. But if you don't, we've provided a link to the website where you find that out. So that's what I'm going to walk through next. You would click that blue text and it'll take you to a page that looks like this. This page is new, so I really want to take some time to walk through it because it can be a little bit complicated if you haven't used it before. This is from the New York City Planning Department. And what we're looking at right now is a map of census areas. We do not want census areas. We want community districts. So the first thing that you're going to need to do is you're going to need to click on where it says community district, and it's going to change the map into these bigger blocks. It's really, really important that you click on community district first and then put in your address. Because if you try to put in your address while it's still on the census tract, it's going to give you totally wrong information. You're not going to find what you need. So click on community district, then put in your address, hit enter. From there, it'll show you, hey, this is where you put the address you put in, and this is the district. Unfortunately, and I want to be very clear, I did not design this tool. If I did, it would then just pop up and tell you what your community district is. But it doesn't work like that. So once it's there, you then need to click another button to where it says View Data, which then takes you to another page. And this is what you're looking for. Up here at the top, it'll say, in this case, Brooklyn Community District 3. I'm sorry this is so complicated. The page that they had before was much, much simpler. But since this is new, I really felt like it was important to show you all because I know that not everyone is familiar with their community board or how to find it. So I wanted to make sure that we all were aware of how to use this tool. Next, we're going to ask you which council district you're in. Similarly, if you're not familiar with what council district you're in, we link you out to the map so you can get that information very, very quickly. It is much more simple. You just put in your address and it'll tell you. So we're not going to walk through that one. But going on from that, we have two more things in terms of geographic area that are a little bit more in the weeds than you may be used to. So first, we're going to ask whether or not your space is located in a designated environmental justice area. So we talked earlier about the leadership of your organization. That's one way that we sort of track equity. The other thing that we look at is environmental justice areas. These are designated by the city and by the state. They use slightly different language, but these are spaces that are, determined by census area and are essentially historically underserved communities. So high poverty areas and high percentages of people of color, as well as areas that are subject to a number of different environmental risks and environmental factors that the city and state really care about. So this is not something that you're expected to know offhand. So the way you find this is by clicking on the link that we have here, which comes to us from the Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice. And you'll see a map that looks like this. This process is much simpler than finding your community district. So you can see that this map is shaded. Parts of it are blue and parts of it are white. All you need to do is click the little magnifying glass in the top right-hand corner, and it's going to open up a little pop-up. You will type in your address, you'll click enter, and it will zoom in to wherever the address is that you put. If the area is blue, then that means, yes, you are in an environmental justice area. It will say designated as DAC. DAC stands for disadvantaged community. It's the same thing. The city and state are like working on combining their language, so they're using the same terms, but just know it's the same thing. Uh, and just to be super clear about it, we use the exact same language that they use on that map. So if you're in a blue area, you're designated as DAC, you'll click yes. If you're in a white area, you're not designated as DAC, you will click no. Very, very simple, very straightforward. Next, we're going to ask for the acreage of open space that you're working in. Now, this is another thing that you're probably not super familiar with. This, I will be clear, only applies to groups working on New York City parkland. However, I'm going to ask all of you to please do your due diligence and at least follow through these steps for the spaces you want to work in, because we found that people are often surprised and didn't realize that the thing they thought was not parkland actually is parkland. And it just saves us a lot of hassle on the back end if you at least give it a shot and check. If it ends up not being parkland, you just type NA and move on, not applicable. But if it is, these are the steps that you use to find out the acreage for your space. First, you go to the New York City Parks website. Welcome if you've never been here before. You're going to start by typing the name of the place in the search bar, in this case, Herbert von King Park. You're going to click search. And from there, you're going to get a page that looks like this. You can either click on the right-hand side of the screen or on the left. It doesn't really matter. Either way, it will take you to a third page, which is essentially, I'll show you in a second, but it's essentially like a profile page for the park. Every single area of parkland in New York City has one. They have more or less information depending on a variety of factors. But for Herbert von King Park, this is the page, and you have to scroll all the way to the bottom. The top of the page looks really, really pretty and nice and has pictures. What we're looking for, you have to scroll all the way to the bottom to find, and it is on the right-hand side of the screen where it says acreage. So in this case, if I was doing work in Herbert von King Park, I would copy 7.82. I would go back into the application, paste that in, and then I'd move on. Again, I know this is a little bit complicated. I really appreciate you all bearing with us. With us being a joint program of both City Parks Foundation and the Parks Department, there are certain things that each of our parents really, really care about. And this is something that the Parks Department really, really cares about, is how much acreage is being served through these programs. So please do your best to get us accurate information in your application. And I should just say, before we move on, that all of this geographic info we talked about is something that we're going to ask you to provide for each site that you're working in. So if you're working in 3 different parks, we're going to ask you for 3 sets of this information, which we know is a lot, but hopefully, once you do it the first time, the next 2 to 3 times should be pretty quick. And again, it's not that you have to work in multiple sites, but you do have that option. All right. Moving into the third page, which is really the heart of the application. This is about your vision. This is about what you want to actually do. So we're going to start by asking you to give your proposal a name. It can be whatever you want. It can be fun. It can be cute. Give it a name. I just think it's fun. And then we're going to get into programming areas. These are the 7 programming areas that we've already discussed. You're able to select up to 3 program areas that you feel like your work covers. Because we hear from folks all the time, right? Like, hey, we're doing like a cleanup event, but then we have this element that like brings in a bunch of young kids from the neighborhood and like teaches them about native plants or something. Or maybe we then like end it with like a music, like a bunch of music and a DJ. So that might be arts and culture, youth development, and stewardship right there, right? So you can see it could also be 3 separate programs. Either way, you're able, excuse me, to select up to 3 for your program to cover. From there, we're going to ask for a proposal overview. Now, this is the biggest section of the application at 300 words. And again, that's a maximum. You don't need to fill that entire space necessarily, to be clear, but that's your word limit is 300. And here we're asking for you to summarize the activities that you're requesting funding for. What do you want this money to do? That's really what it comes down to. And I always tell people, if you're feeling a little bit overwhelmed in trying to explain that, you can't go wrong with just answering the simple questions of who, what, where, when, and how. If you give us really clear answers to those questions, you're in good shape. But I'll say a little bit more in that, like, this whole third page of the application, I really want you to think of as like one big thing, like split up into different pieces. So it should be very internally consistent. What that means is, if you're telling me in your proposal overview that you want to do a movie night and an arts and crafts project and a bunch of park cleanups, that means that later on, when we get to goals, you should have goals related to each of those things, right? It shouldn't be that only one part of your project has goals associated with it. Or when you get into the funding request, we shouldn't suddenly see, oh, so and so is asking for $700 for a projector for a movie, but what is that about, right? So we want to make sure that everything is internally consistent. If you mention something in one part of your application, carry it through and make sure that it's there in every other part of your application as much as possible. So, but this proposal overview is really where it all starts. This is you telling us this is what we're going to do with the money. Great. From there, we're going to ask you why. Why does that matter? Why does that matter to the people in your neighborhood? What needs are you serving? Because that's what this is all about, right? Is connecting to the people in our neighborhoods and making sure that we're being responsive to what's going on. So I like to think of this, if the proposal overview is the who, what, where, when, and how, community needs is really the why. How your organization is positioned to meet the needs that you see in your neighborhood. A really quick example might be, hey, like we know that a bunch of local schools have had their after school programming cut. So that's a need, right? So we want to step in and provide more free programs for children and families in our neighborhood. That's like a very simple, here's a thing we know that's happening, here's how we can step up and make a difference. I'll say that it can also be a positive thing. We've had groups who've said, we're doing so well, so many volunteers are coming through that we actually can't keep up with demand. And so this is about expanding what we're doing to make sure that we're meeting that need, because people are showing us and telling us they want to do more, right? So it doesn't always have to be a negative. Moving on, I already gave us a little, a precursor to this, but we're going to ask for you to have goals and measurable outcomes. And the measurable part is really important. So every good goal should contain a few things. It should have a target, which means a number, something that you can actually say yes or no, this happened. A good goal, a bad goal is that you want to change the world. We can't measure that. I don't know if you did that or not, right? So we want things that can really come down and be measured in some form of a number, but we also want an explanation of steps you're going to take to achieve that goal. If I say I want to be a millionaire tomorrow, that sounds pretty unrealistic, but maybe I have a really great plan for how I'm going to get there, right? Like I certainly will need one if I'm going to do that. So make sure you tell us about the steps you're going to take and then also how you're going to actually measure that outcome. So I'm not going to go through all of these examples, but please feel free to refer to these examples as you're working through your goals. That's why we provide them there. But just to go through the first one, a good goal might be we aim to support 100 hours of volunteer stewardship work. There's a number, we can measure that. Through our bi-weekly park cleanups. We will attend local community board meetings to promote our work, so that's what we're going to do, right? That's how we're going to make sure that we get the volunteers we need to actually hit that 100-hour mark. And we're going to measure those hours using volunteer sign in and sign out sheets so we know how many hours everyone's actually contributing. If we don't have any of those, if we're missing even one of those three parts, right? Suddenly you can see the goal is a lot weaker because we don't know how you're going to do it, or we don't know how you're going to measure it, or we don't know what you're aiming for. So try to make sure that each of those goals, each of the goals that you provide us with, again, up to 3 different goals, have those components and are really, really strong. From there, we're going to ask for a proposal timeline. A really quick note here is that no grant-funded activities should be planned before May 2025, right? You're not going to even know if you got the money until May 2025, so please don't plan things that are supposed to start next month in March. You'd be surprised, groups do this all the time. And it doesn't work because we can't fund things retroactively. If everyone was doing that, it would be putting people in bad positions, right? People would be spending money that they think they have, and then it doesn't come through, and we don't want that for you. So just avoid that. No activities should be planned before May 2025. Um, this proposal timeline does not need to be exhaustive. It can literally be a bulleted list if you want, but what we're looking for are just kind of like the key dates. So if you're doing a series of park cleanups, are those happening, every other week? Are they happening once a month? When are they starting? When are they ending? They go from April to October. If you're putting on a big music festival, is there a date when you know that you're going to need to have all of the artists booked, right? Like, because, oh, I know that I have to have that done 2 months in advance. This is not just for us, this is ultimately also an activity and an exercise for you all to really think through the steps of what it's going to take to carry out this work. We want to see that you're thinking through the project and not just, hey, I need this money and don't worry, in a year it'll be done. That's not what we want. We want to make sure that you actually have steps in place to carry out the work that you're asking to do. From that, we're going to ask you about any organizational partners that you might have. This is not anyone and everyone that you've ever worked with. These are people or groups specifically who will be helping you with the project that you're getting funded for. So you may know, right? Like, oh, I have a really close relationship with the local PTA, and they'll definitely put out all of our events in their newsletters. That'll be great because we're trying to increase the number of kids that we reach, right? Like that's a really clear example of an organizational partnership. Anything like that that is directly going to go into helping you be successful with this work, that's what we want to know about. Next, we're going to talk about the financials. So we're going to take a brief detour here to think back to last year. We're going to ask you once again how much money your organization spent last year. So those total expenses, was it less than $10,000 or was it over $10,000? There are a few branching questions that I don't have on the screen here, but essentially it's just a series of yes or no questions. The next one is, have you received a grant from us since 2020? All of this is just to get at, okay, are you applying for 1 year funding or 2 year funding? And how much are you asking us for? That's the real thing. There's going to be a box at the end of that series of questions that's your funding request, and that is how much money you are asking for. And in the case of 2 year funds, it would be, remember, it would be how much you're getting each of those years. So if you're eligible for $2,500 per year, it wouldn't be 5,000, it would be 2,500. We already know that you're asking it for 2 years, right? So that's not shown here. It's a bunch of very simple yes or no questions. But again, the core piece is to get down to what that funding request is. How much money are you asking for? And just like with your budget from 2024, if you tell me that you're asking for $2,500, my follow-up is going to be, great. What are you going to use that for? And that's where we get into the actual funding request. And you're going to need to upload something that actually shows us a breakdown of what your project budget would be, right? Your funding request. So I want, if it's $2,500, maybe I need $500 for plants. I need $300 for tools. I need, $600 because I'm gonna, give a bunch of local students stipends to help out with this. You can kind of see what I'm getting at. You don't have to come up with this on your own. I know that budgeting is not a skill that everyone is super comfortable with. So we've actually given you an example and provided an Excel template that you all can use if it's helpful to you. So this is the example here. This is once again, this is linked directly in the application. So this is an example of what a funding request form should look like. And we have a blank one of these that I've created. All the formulas and everything are already set up, so you don't have to do any of that. And you can see exactly what I'm talking about. We split things up into non-staffing expenses and staffing expenses. So I want 10 shovels and it's going to cost me 250 bucks. I'm going to pay a musician and that's going to cost me 300. Flowers are 500, so on and so forth. And this is really about the level of detail we're looking for. We don't need to know that you're going to spend $100 on roses and $200 on tulips and $300 on so and so. You can just say flowers. That's okay. But we do kind of want to, don't say gardening stuff and have that be $2,500. That's not going to work either. So somewhere in this range, I'm sure you all can kind of see what we're going for. Um, the other piece here at the bottom is we know that sometimes groups have additional like outside funding. So for example, you may be getting $1,000 from Citizens Committee, which is another group that provides a lot of grassroots grant support. That's really great. If this is going towards other work that you're doing and you want to let us know, that's totally cool. But one thing that sometimes trips people up is that the funding request form should really only include expenses that will be paid for using your Green Fund award. So if you want to tell us about additional funding you're receiving, that's totally cool. But the expenses should really only be what you're asking us for money to do. Sometimes people will say, like, they'll give us all of the expenses for their whole upcoming year. And then we're like, wait a second, what are we paying for in this? And it's very, very difficult to track. And we need to know exactly what we're paying for because we need to make sure it's all eligible, right? Going back to what is allowed and what isn't allowed. So please make sure that you're only submitting expenses that are going to be paid for using this award. We're almost to the end here. I know we're running close on time, but we're nearly done. After you give us your funding request, we're going to ask, why this money is so important to you. What kind of an impact would it have on your organization right now? So that's the funding need question. Sometimes folks will say, oh, we had our tool shed broken into and we lost a bunch of stuff. We need to replace it. Or again, sometimes it can be positive. We're growing really quickly and we're struggling to keep up with that. And we need some additional funds to, have us help us hire a part-time person so that we can do some of this stuff, right? Whatever it is, whatever that impact would be, this is your chance to tell us, and don't be shy. Nothing you say here can hurt your application. Sometimes people get a little bit worried about that. And then lastly, we have a bunch of supplemental materials. So we have two places where you can upload basically any file you want. So PDFs of like past brochures that you've done, you could upload videos that you've taken, you could upload photos, whatever you'd like, really. The sky's the limit. These are not required things, they're all optional. But we do find that people our reviewers really enjoy seeing photos of the work that you all have done. Like I said, we've had people submit videos in the past, past flyers, all that stuff is really cool, and we enjoy seeing it. But again, it's not required, so don't feel like you have to. But if you have it, it's great. We also give you an option to link us to any online material. So maybe if you've done a YouTube video or if you've been featured in a news article, that could be great things to share. And lastly, if you're like me and you talk and talk and talk and you have a million things to say and you never shut up, you have 100 extra words to just say whatever it is you want to say. And you're welcome to fill that however you'd like. And with that, that's the end of the application. You all have seen line by line exactly what you need to do, and we've all talked about it, and I'm sure you're going to have A+ applications once you all submit. So with that, I'm going to open it up for any questions, and I saw that chat was really going, so I'm sure we've got some good ones.
Yeah, Zach, you want me to just start
Yeah, yeah,
the
if you don't
ones that I've
mind.
got? Yeah, okay. So the first one we had was would Green Fund consider grants to public park-like cemeteries?
Would Greens Fund consider grants to park? Did you say that one more time? Sorry.
Grants for public park-like cemeteries. So I think just public cemeteries.
I want to say the answer is yes, but whoever asked that, I would ask that you get in touch with us so we can talk about the specifics. Because I think the specifics of how public it is and when people can access and how is going to be really important. Joe, I see you have your hand raised. If you could drop it in the chat, it's a lot easier. Thanks.
Okay, and then next we had if you receive a grant, does that also include receiving permission to create your idea within the city park, or is that a separate process?
That's a really, really great question, whoever asked that. I want to be very clear about this. We are a public-private program, right? But what that means is that we are not the people who decide permits. I want to be very clear about that. We can grant you funding for something. It is still your responsibility to get all the required permits necessary to actually carry out that work or that event. We do our best to, as part of the review process, to weed out anything that we think is not going to fly with parks, which sometimes unfortunately happens. So we do our best to only fund projects that we strongly believe parks will approve. But it is ultimately up to you all to submit those applications for your permits, talk to the right people and do that work. Our CECs are there to help, our community engagement coordinators, as well as our grants team. But to be very, very clear, no, getting funded for this work is not the same as getting the permits.
Okay, and then the next question is whose budget um is whose budget do you want, the applicant or the 501(c)(3)?
Um, I'm a little bit confused by that. No, like whoever is applying for the grant should be the ones receiving the funds. If what you're asking about is a fiscal sponsor, so for example, let's say I have a park group and we're fiscally sponsored by Open Space Institute. They're a group that like sponsors a lot of folks. I would need your budget, not Open Space Institute's, right? Because think about it. If we get your fiscal sponsor's budget, that's probably way more than $175,000 last year, right? So we want you, whoever it is that's doing the work and the sort of people who are carrying it out, that's whose budget we need from 2024.
Okay, yeah, I think it looks like you answered it. Nicole said got it. So
Awesome.
yeah.
Great.
And then the next
Um,
one in the chat from earlier was if the group submitting is a PTA that has to use funds in a specific way, would it be best to have a fiscal sponsor instead of having funds go to the PTA?
mm. I'm not sure about that because I know like some PTAs are like their own like their own organizations sometimes. Like we've had that in the past. But if they're associated, like if they're directly a body under the school, like, they're like under the organizational structure of the school, then that might need a fiscal sponsor. This is another group that I'm going to ask you to like just reach out and share with us more directly over email your specific circumstances. Because I think it should be okay, but I would need to know a lot more to be able to give you a good answer.
Okay, and then I think asked by the same person, maybe was does a school count as a public space even if the schoolyard isn't always publicly accessible?
No, it does not. Folks ask this all the time, and what I always say is like, I could not walk into a public school right now. I could not freely walk into a public school right now or any given day of the week because I'm not a kid and I don't have kids there. And so, as much as we love our schools, they are slightly separate spaces. They're not fully publicly accessible in the way that our parks or other spots that we talk about are. So, unfortunately, no.
Okay, next question. Would starting a pollinator garden also be a type of environmental action?
I would say it depends on what you're doing. It could be if you're teaching people, like if there's an educational component that's teaching people about, the benefits of native pollinators, or, there's a group that we funded a couple of years ago that did a big pollinator giveaway. And so they did this whole educational event, in their neighborhood, where they brought people in basically for kind of like a teach-in on why pollinators are so great. And then they like had pledge forms where people are like, I'm gonna replace the flowers in my yard with pollinators. And then they gave people a bunch of pollinating plants, which was really cool. I would say that's environmental action. And so it just kind of depends on how you're thinking about it. But I would say probably yes.
Okay, next question was, would purchasing food for volunteers be a type of stipend?
Purchasing food for no, it is not. That's just food. Anybody
Okay.
can have food. A
Okay, and
stipend
then
is money that you're putting directly like into people's pockets, basically. They can use that money for whatever they want.
the last one from the earlier questions is what if it's two sites in the same park?
What if it's two sites in the same park? That's fine. You just list the one park, but piggybacking off the permit question from before, you should be aware that different sites in the park sometimes have more like particularities about what can be done where because of like how much shade they get or how close they are to a tree or foot traffic or whatever. So, the answer for like the geographic stuff is you would just count that all as like one space because it's all like let's just say Herbert von King Park or whatever, even though it's two different locations. But for permits, you would still need to probably sort that out. Not probably, you would almost definitely need to sort that out on a case by case basis.
Okay, and then I think we might have the follow-up to the food question is can pizza be a part of the grant money?
Yes.
Okay.
I would say any food or anything like that for any events that you all are doing would fall under program supplies in our eligible expenses list.
Okay, and then on to the more recent questions. This is from Joe. For stipends for volunteers or youth interns, do we need a 501(c)(3) designation?
For stipends, you don't. And that's why we're very strict about that $600 per person limit, because beyond that, you're entering into like you need to submit stuff to the IRS, and that's where that gets complicated. And we're not going to do that and take on that burden, so that's why we limit that $600 mark. And I see these other questions, Anna, so I'll just go ahead and hit these from Joe. Joe asks for items in the urban forestry category, it's still beholden to the same total bucket of funding, no other special requirements. So there are kind of two questions in that question, Joe. So the first, urban forestry is still beholden to the same amount. So if you're eligible for 2,500, it's not like here's 1,000 extra bonus bucks for urban forestry. It just means that on our end, we're pulling it from a different pot. That's all that means. And we need to know who's doing it so we know like what pot we're pulling from. And on no other special requirements for that category, there are a few follow-up questions that we didn't cover here. They're all very, very straightforward, but if you select urban forestry, basically we're going to ask a couple of additional things where you basically check a box to say, oh, have you done something like this before? Yes or no? If so, did you work with any of these lists of partners? Tree Time, Forest for All, Natural Areas Conservancy. We want to get a sense of how familiar folks are with. One, to evaluate how realistic the proposal is, but also on the more positive side, to just understand, okay, this group might need a little bit more support to carry this out, and do we need to connect them to people if they're awarded funding? So it's just helpful for us to understand that stuff. But yeah, so there are no additional requirements, but yes, additional like questions. And the last one that I saw from Joe here, for semi-permanent infrastructure, i.e. fencing to reseed a lawn, you still need Parks Department to sign off. Yes, you do. Yes, you do. Uh, Anna, do you want to jump back in? Not sure if there are any others if I missed.
Yeah, there's a few more that came in. Should we clear work with the Parks Department before applying?
Yes, absolutely, you have to. It is a requirement. And if you start doing stuff without Parks permission, we will hear about it and it's not fun. So, absolutely, yes, you have to clear things with Parks or whoever it might be. If you're doing work in open streets or in a plaza or whatever, you would need to talk to DOT, so on and so forth. You have to get your permits. Um,
Okay,
I
and then,
see.
oh,
Yeah,
do you
sorry.
see them?
I have it open now. I still have it open
Okay.
from Joe. So, Gigi asks if the community garden can be locked at night to prevent vandalism. Yes, we know that this is standard practice. Many of our parks lock up at night too. That you're still publicly accessible, right? Like it's always a spectrum. It's not yes, you're accessible all the time, always. No, you're not. We understand it's a spectrum, so that's totally fine. Um, Robin says in the application when it asks for 3 sites, do we just include the one park? Um, I think we answered this earlier, but just to be super, super clear, Robin, what the language we use is the name of the open space. So the name of the open space, again, to use my example, like Herbert von King Park, would be Herbert von King Park. Even if I'm like doing something in this garden bed on the north side of the park, and then maybe I'm doing something over on the lawn on the south side of the park, like that's all still Herbert von King Park. So in the application, you would just say the name of the space. You wouldn't list out like every single site as its own separate thing. Um, would a rain garden in a school be part of org development if the rain garden will be used to collect seeds to disperse for a project in a park? Um, I don't think so. I think that's probably environmental action because the org you're not like um sort of increasing like internal capacity in the same way that we typically think of that. So I would say probably not. I also want people like don't stress too hard over the program areas. We're not gonna look at something and be like, oh, they said that's environmental action, but really that should be youth development. X, like they're not eligible anymore. Do your best, but we understand, right? Things are multifaceted, things, bleed from one category to another. So don't stress too much about it. Just give it your best shot at being accurate. But I don't want anybody to freak out about it. Um, Denise, I would prefer that you reach out via email. It's just much easier for us to keep track of that way. Regarding the cemetery question. And sorry, y'all, we're at 7:31, so we have a bunch more things still in the chat. I am gonna answer Robin's last question, and this is probably gonna be it. Grant money could be used at a school garden if the plants will eventually be used at a park. Robin, I think you maybe were the person asking about the school garden in the first place. Grant funds can't be used in spaces that are not publicly accessible. So even if it was like, we're gonna use this to then collect seeds to then go do a thing in a park, this grant program is about activating openly, publicly accessible spaces. As much as we love our schools, a school garden is not publicly accessible in that way. Now, if you wanted funds to do the thing that's actually in the park specifically, that would be okay, but we're not going to fund things happening at the school explicitly. That's not going to work, unfortunately. Um, all right, everyone. It's 7:32, nearly on time. Thank you all so much for being an attentive audience. We know it was a lot of information. Please feel free to reach out to us if you have any other questions, and be on the lookout for that follow-up email tomorrow. I would love to see each and every one of you in a consultation. So get those drafts ready to go, and then please hit me up. I have lots of time. And I was just telling Anna actually earlier today that consultations with all of you is truly my favorite part of my job. So really, really looking forward to talking with all of you. And with that, I'll say good night. So take care, everyone, and best of luck on your applications.